In this video, we're making two different designs for simple knotted wraps. These could either be bracelets or necklaces or even anklets. We're making one with only one strand and the other with two, so they look slightly different. They both have beads knotted loosely along them and they look really cute when they're wrapped around in a bracelet stack or just worn as a necklace. You can use whatever type of beads you like and knot the beads closer together or further apart as well. First up, we're going to make the double strand design. We're using 0.8mm polyester cotton blend twine, and we need about 200 centimeters of thread. For a necklace, that's about 21 inches long or 3 wraps around a bracelet. It's about 65 centimeters of twine for each wrap around a bracelet. So we measure out and cut that nice long length of twine. Now first up, we place a button on for our clasp. I've got a cute little 11mm blue button, so threading that onto our thread, then placing the ends together. Following it back down to the other end, we want to find the middle in our thread. So holding that button in the middle there, we tie a simple overhand knot in our thread, bringing it around itself and pulling the tails through the loop, pulling it down tight towards the button to secure it in place. Now one of our threads, I like to cut a little pointy end on the end of the thread. This makes it easier to thread the beads on, and also I can keep the beads on the same thread every time. I don't know that that's super important, but I find the beads sit a little bit nicer if they're always on the same thread. So placing your first bead onto that thread and bringing it up near the button. Now holding tension on the button to pull your bracelet out straight. We're going to tie another simple overhand knot in both threads. So bringing it around your finger to form a loop and pulling the tails through the loop. And we want to pull it down onto about the 1 inch mark. So measuring from knot to knot. Of course you can do this a little bit closer together or further apart as well, but I do mine about 1 inch apart. So pulling it down tight onto that 1 inch mark. And then threading another bead on. We're using 6mm Amazonite beads today. You can use whatever beads you like, they just need to have a hole big enough to fit the thread inside. Again, pulling tension onto that button so that your bracelet forms nice and straight. Now we tie another simple overhand knot, making a loop and bringing the tails through, and pull it down onto the 1 inch mark away from that previous knot. So this is a really simple design. We just continue placing our bead onto that same thread. Pulling tension onto that button to keep your bracelet straight, and then tying a simple overhand knot, pulling it down nice and tight onto the 1 inch mark away from the previous knot. So we just continue doing the same technique until your bracelet is as long as you want it. I usually bead down to about 21 inches long for a bracelet that wraps around 3 times. Once you're close to your desired length, it's a good idea to check it around your neck or around your wrist. So you can see here, this one wraps around 3 times, and then just at the end of that last bead, we're going to place a little clasp and that'll fit perfectly. So just showing you the length on this one here from the button. That last bead is sitting right on the 21 inch mark. So it's just slightly bigger than that. Now after our last knot, we're going to place another overhand knot this time without placing a bead on first. So we want to pull it down tight about the same size as our button. That button needs to slip between the two knots, but not be too loose or too tight. So just pulling that down about that same size as your button, and then checking it to see if the button can slide through. You can always untie and retie these knots as you go if needed, but you want that button to fit through quite snugly so it's held in place when you're wearing it. If you're happy with the size of your buttonhole, then you can go ahead and cut your tails off, and then I singe the ends with a lighter as well so they don't fray. So there's your first loosely knotted bracelet with a double strand twine. Now it's on to the single strand twine. Similar design with our beads spaced out about 1 inch apart, but this one we just knot each bead onto the same twine for a slightly different look. For this design we need about 140 centimeters of our 0.8 millimeter polyester cotton thread, and that's for a necklace about 21 inches long or 3 wraps around your wrist. This design uses about 50 centimeters per wrap around your wrist. Using a button for this clasp as well, we place it on the end. This time we're going to keep the button on the end though, just bringing that tail through long enough to tie a simple overhand knot, making a loop around your finger and pulling the ends through the loop. Gently pulling that knot down quite close to the button to secure it in place. Once you've got your button on, we can go ahead and start placing beads on. I find it's helpful to cut a little angle on the end of my twine, just so it fits through my beads easier. So placing our first bead on, again we're using 6mm Amazonite beads. Same as with the other design, you can measure out these beads as far along as you like, but I tend to do mine about 1 inch apart. So for this one you want to sort of hold your bead down about where you want it to be, and then tie your simple overhand knot around the bead. Mine are going to be about 1 inch away from the previous one. And then we tie a simple overhand knot around the bead. So the bead is sitting inside the overhand knot. Then you can sort of work with your bead and slide it along a little bit if it needs it until it's sitting in the right position. You can always undo and retie these knots as you go along. Once you're happy with the position, then we go ahead and do another simple overhand knot. I try and do the second one the opposite way to the first overhand knot, just to lock that in place. Pulling it down nice and tight. And then placing your next bead on. Bringing it down, and then we can take our time getting the bead in the right position. So I place it sort of loosely in the right spot, and then tie our first simple overhand knot around the bead, and then measure it down so that we can get it accurately in that right position, 1 inch away from the other bead. When you're happy with the position, then you can tie your second overhand knot the opposite way to the first one and pull that really nice and tight to lock the bead in place. Now we just continue the same technique, placing our beads on and tying simple overhand knots to secure that bead in place about 1 inch from the previous bead. I bead down to about 21 inches long for a bracelet that wraps around your wrist 3 times. Once you're close to your desired length, you can try it on for size. We want it meeting up pretty close so that when we tie our loop, it's going to slip just over the button. If you're happy with the length, then we can tie a loop on the end for our closure. So we bring the end back to form a loop on the end. We want this loop about the size of our button, so just bringing it around and tying a simple overhand knot. I'm so sorry I go a little bit off screen, hopefully you still can see what I'm doing. Tying a loop, pulling it down nice and tight so that your loop is about that same size as your button. You want your button to fit through that loop nice and snug so it's not too big or too small. Now if you're happy with the sizing of everything and it fits really well, then you can go ahead and cut these tail ends off and cinch them with a lighter so they don't fray.